If someone tells you that family is always the one place you can trust the most, then they've never grown up in a family like mine. I used to believe that. Used to think that blood ties were what kept people together. But then, I learned a harsh lesson. Sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who exploit you the most. My name is Ivy, and my story begins when I was 24. I lived in my late grandmother's old house, a small but sturdy home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She left it to me when she passed because, out of everyone in the family, I was the only one she trusted. She knew exactly what my mother would do if she got her hands on the house: sell it, spend all the money, and then complain about how unfair life was to her. The house wasn't big, nor was it luxurious, but it was mine. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of birds outside my porch, brewed coffee in the old but cozy kitchen, and enjoyed the peace I had never known while living with my mother, stepfather, and my younger sister, Lily. My family lived in a modern house in the city, but the truth was, they didn't fully own it. They still had a hefty mortgage, and with the way my mother spent money, I knew that debt would last forever. My mother wasn't good with finances. In fact, she was excellent at spending money, just never her own. Lily, my half-sister, had just turned 19 that year and had always been my mother's favorite. When I was in school, I wore hand-me-down clothes, took the bus, and worked part-time jobs to cover my tuition. But when Lily turned 16, my mother bought her a brand new car, while I was still taking the morning bus to work. I was used to it. Used to being the invisible one in the family. I never complained. I had a stable job, a house of my own, and most importantly, I wasn't dependent on anyone. Then, one Sunday afternoon, my mother showed up at my doorstep, a forced smile on her face. "Ivy, sweetheart, I have something to talk to you about," she started, her voice unnaturally sweet. I invited her inside, poured her a cup of coffee, and waited to see what she had to say. I was familiar with visits like these. My mother never came just to see me. There was always a reason. "Your stepfather and I have been thinking a lot about this house," she said, setting her cup down on my grandmother's old wooden table. "Honestly, it's the perfect home for us. Peaceful, with a garden, fresh air. It's nothing like our city house. So noisy and cramped all the time?" I nodded, waiting for what was coming next. "And we've been thinking about you too, Ivy," she continued, her eyes lighting up like she had just discovered the best idea in the world. "You work so far away, driving over an hour to the office every morning. If you lived in the city, imagine how much time you'd save. Our house is much closer to the center, bigger, more modern. It suits you way more than it suits us." I gripped my coffee cup tighter, a sinking feeling creeping down my spine. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I'm saying we should swap houses. You move into our city home and we'll take this one. You just have to take over the remaining mortgage. After all, you have a good job, right?" I looked at her, wondering just how stupid she thought I was. "And what about the deed? Will we make it official?" My mother waved her hand dismissively, as if the idea was ridiculous. "Oh, Ivy, you're always so serious. We're family. Who needs contracts or lawyers? Your stepfather and I would never do anything to hurt you. I promise." I used to trust my mother. But that was before I learned that her promises had never meant anything. I can't say I fully believed in my mother's offer from the start. But I agreed, because a part of me wanted to believe she genuinely had my best interests at heart. The house swap happened faster than I expected. 1 month after that conversation, I moved into the city house, and my mother and stepfather took over my grandmother's home. We didn't sign any legal documents, just a verbal agreement. Everyone said I was lucky. My friends envied me for moving into a bigger, more modern house closer to the city center. But no one knew I was now carrying the burden of a massive mortgage. A debt that was never supposed to be mine. I didn't have time to think too much about it. My job at the media company was at its busiest, and I was working overtime constantly. That meant I had no time to question the deal. I just kept sending the mortgage payments to my mother every month, on time, without fail. At first, my mother seemed grateful. "Thank you, Ivy. Because of you, your stepfather and I can finally live comfortably in this house." I didn't question anything. I thought I was doing the right thing, that one day, this house would truly be mine. And I wasn't just paying the mortgage, I invested in the house. I replaced the water heater because the old system kept breaking. I renovated the bathroom, installed a new sink, and retiled the floors. I upgraded the kitchen cabinets because I wanted the house to feel like my home. Each time I spent money, I told myself, this is a long-term investment. I'm building my future. For the first 3 years, everything seemed fine. I paid the mortgage on time, made home improvements, and went on with my life. But then, small red flags started appearing. Things I hadn't noticed before or had chosen to ignore. At first, it was just an offhand comment from my mother over the phone. "Ivy, I was thinking, could you pay a little more? The interest rates just went up and your stepfather and I have a lot of expenses." I didn't think much of it since I could afford it. I agreed to send an extra $200 per month, believing it would help pay off the mortgage sooner. But once turned into twice. Then 3 times. "Ivy, the electricity bill was high this month, could you help a little?" "Ivy, the house needs plumbing repairs, I know you have some savings, right?" I didn't realize I was being drained little by little, until sending extra money became a habit. By the 4th year, I started feeling like something was off. One day, I ran into my grandmother's old neighbor, Mrs. Rose. What she said stopped me in my tracks. "Your mother must be so happy living in that house rent-free." I froze. Rent-free? No way. I had been sending the mortgage payments every month. If I hadn't, they would have lost the house. But Mrs. Rose just shrugged. "Your mother told me they paid it off 2 years ago. She's quite the money-savvy woman, isn't she?" I stood there in the middle of the grocery store, feeling like someone had just poured ice-cold water down my back. 2 years ago? If the house had already been paid off, then where had all the money I sent for the past 2 years gone? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing. I needed to find out before it was too late. 2 weeks away from home wasn't a long time, but I never thought my world could change so drastically in that short period. The business trip to Texas ended later than expected, and all I wanted was to go home, take a hot shower, curl up on my couch, and sleep for hours. I had even texted my mom that morning to let her know I'd be home that night. She didn't reply, but I didn't think much of it. My mom wasn't the type to respond right away. It was already dark when the taxi pulled up in front of my house. I dragged my suitcase up the porch steps, reaching into my bag for my keys. Then suddenly, I froze. The lights inside were on. At first I thought maybe Mom had stopped by to clean or check on something, but when I slid my key into the lock, it didn't fit. I tried again, and then a third time. The lock had been changed. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was going on? I raised my hand and knocked, trying to stay calm. Laughter echoed from inside. Lily's laughter. The door swung open. My sister stood there, arms crossed over her chest, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings. My sweater and leggings. Behind her, a man I didn't recognize lounged on my couch, looking at me like I was a stranger. "Oh, you're back?" Lily tilted her head, her tone indifferent. I looked past her into the house. Something was off. My furniture had been rearranged, my photos were gone, and worst of all, there were 2 large suitcases sitting in the corner of the living room. A cold dread settled over me. "Lily, what's going on?" My voice was dry, barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" she chuckled. "Oh, you don't know? You don't live here anymore." I stood frozen. "What?" Lily sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Mom and Dad gave this house to me as a wedding gift." She lifted her left hand, flashing a diamond ring under the living room light. "This is Jake's and my home now." You don't live here anymore. It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. Mom and Dad did what? My voice cracked. They gave it to us. Lily shrugged. They said you'd understand. After all, it's not like you actually owned it. It owned it. I let out a short, hollow laugh. It sounded foreign, like it didn't belong to me. I paid the mortgage on this house for 4 years. I renovated it, spent my own money fixing everything. So? Lily blinked, expression blank. It's ours now. You don't live here anymore, Ivy. You should leave before I have to call the police. The police? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stepped forward, my voice ice cold. Lily, let me inside. Right. Now. But instead of moving, she raised her hand and made a dismissive shooing motion. No, sis, this is Jake's and my house now. If you don't leave, we really will call the cops. The door slammed shut in my face. Cold. I felt cold, down to my bones. I didn't know how long I stood there. My head was spinning. My grip tightening around my suitcase handle as I struggled to breathe. A million thoughts rushed through my mind. Did they really do this to me? What had I done to deserve this? Did my mother actually agree to this? Instinct told me I needed answers. Now. I rushed to my car, threw my suitcase into the back seat, slammed my foot on the gas and headed straight for my grandmother's house. The house where my mom and stepfather were living. I wasn't leaving until I heard the truth from them. I drove like a storm, fury burning in my chest. Lily's words echoed in my head like knives slicing through my soul. He gave it to us as a wedding gift. This is our home now. You should leave before I call the police. I couldn't believe it. How could my mother do this to me? I had paid for that house, rebuilt every inch of it, poured years of my life into making it a home. And in just 2 weeks, I was suddenly homeless, standing on my own doorstep like a stranger. When I pulled up in front of my grandmother's house, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The lights were on. I saw my mother's silhouette move behind the living room curtains. She knew I was coming. I jumped out of the car, stormed up the porch steps, and pounded on the door. Mom, open the door! I heard movement inside, hushed voices, then silence. I banged on the door harder. Mom, I know you're in there. Open the door now. Finally, the door cracked open, just enough for my mother to peek out. She looked at me, her expression eerily calm. Ivy, you're back, she said lightly, as if I had just dropped by for a casual visit and wasn't standing there, homeless, betrayed, and furious. What is going on? I hissed, my fragile grip on composure slipping fast. Lily said that house is hers now. Is that true? My mother didn't even blink. She just shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Yes, it's true. I couldn't believe my ears. What are you saying? I paid for that house for 4 years. I invested in it. She raised a hand, cutting me off. Ivy, you didn't actually think that house was yours, did you? A wave of dizziness hit me, as if all the air had been sucked from my lungs. What did you just say? I whispered. My mother folded her arms, her voice turning firm, final. This house belongs to Lily and Jake now. They're newlyweds. They need a stable place to start their life together. You're young. You can rent, find another place. And what about this house? I demanded, pointing behind her. Grandma's house? Don't tell me you took this one too. Ivy, my mother sighed, slipping into that condescending tone I hated. You have to understand, this house belongs to me and your stepfather now. We've lived here for 4 years, invested in it. This is our home. I took a step back, feeling like a tidal wave had just crashed over me. You planned this from the start, didn't you? My voice cracked. Not just with anger, but with raw, aching betrayal. You used me. I paid for that house, and you and Dad got to keep Grandma's. This was your plan all along. To take everything from me. She didn't say anything, but I saw it. The brief flicker in her eyes. Guilt. Hesitation. Then, just as quickly, she masked it. Ivy, stop acting like a spoiled child. You talk as if I owe you something. I raised you for years, I did everything for you, and now you're blaming me over a house? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. House? I let out a bitter laugh. No, Mom, this isn't just a house. This was everything I had. 4 years of my life. Every dollar I saved, all my work to build a home. And you? You stole it from me. Threw me out like garbage, and now you're standing here telling me you did everything for me? For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Worry? Maybe even regret. But it vanished just as quickly. Oh, come on, Ivy. My stepfather's voice rang out from inside. You're overreacting. You're young. You can start over. No need to make a big deal out of this. I turned to look at him, disgust rising like bile in my throat. Right, start over. Well, you and he have 2 houses, and I have nowhere to go. My mother crossed her arms, her gaze turning ice cold. Ivy, you need to leave. You're really doing this to me? You're an adult. Stop making a fuss. Grow up. The pain was suffocating. I stood there, looking at the woman who gave birth to me. The person who was supposed to love and protect me. But instead, she was throwing me out like a stranger. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned away. As I stepped down the porch, a freezing wind swept past me, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the hearts of the people in that house. I don't remember how far I drove or how long I sat in my car after leaving my grandmother's house. All I remembered was the bone-deep betrayal. They had planned it from the start, step by step, stripping me of everything. The house I paid the mortgage on for 4 years. The savings I had built up. The dreams I had nurtured. And now, I had nothing. No, that wasn't true. I still had one thing. Grandma's house. Anger flared in my chest like a wildfire. They might have stolen the house I paid for, but there was no way they were taking the house that was legally mine. I pulled out my phone and searched for a name I never thought I'd need, a real estate attorney. 3 days later, I was sitting in the office of Richard Carter, a lawyer in his 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. After I explained everything, he nodded slowly. I understand, he said, flipping through a stack of documents his assistant had just handed him. Your grandmother's house is still legally under your name. If your parents refuse to leave, we can file a lawsuit and submit an eviction order immediately. I took a deep breath, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. How long will it take? I asked. Not long, he replied, giving me a confident smile. With the evidence you have, I'd say they'll be out in just a few days. I clenched my fists, determination flooding through me. This time, I wasn't going to let them take advantage of me again. A week later, I stood outside my grandmother's house with Attorney Carter, the house that was legally mine. My mother opened the door, and her expression darkened the moment she saw us. Ivy, what do you want now? She asked, her voice cold. You know what I want, I said, keeping my voice steady but firm. I'm here to take back my house. Attorney Carter stepped forward, handing my mother a stack of documents. Mrs. Carter, under the law, this property still legally belongs to Ivy. This is an eviction notice. You and your husband have 3 days to vacate. If not, we will involve the authorities. My mother snatched the papers, scanning them quickly, and for a brief second I saw panic flicker in her eyes. This can't be happening, she whispered, turning to my stepfather. Do something. But my stepfather just stood there, his face red with anger but silent. Attorney Carter adjusted his tie, his voice professional and unwavering. If you refuse to leave, we will proceed with legal enforcement to have you forcibly removed. I had never seen my mother so furious. Evie, you really doing this to your own mother? She screamed, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. After everything I've done for you, you're turning your back on your family? I looked her straight in the eye, no longer afraid, no longer wavering. No, Mom, I said slowly. I'm just taking back what's mine. 3 days later, just as the court order stated, my mother and stepfather were forced to move out of my grandmother's house. That morning I drove over and watched from a distance, as they packed their belongings into a rented moving truck. My mother stood on the porch, staring at me with a mix of hatred and pain. "You're no longer my daughter, Ivy," she said bitterly. "You're a traitor." I stood still, saying nothing. I had expected to feel victorious, but all I felt was a hollow emptiness. She stepped down the porch and got into the truck, slamming the door shut. I watched as the truck rolled away from the driveway. The house was finally mine. But at what cost? Grandma's house belonged to me now, but I couldn't erase what my family had done. I had nowhere else to go but here, and even then, victory brought me no comfort. But soon my mother's nightmare truly began. For 4 years, I had paid the mortgage on that house, believing I was investing in my future. But now that they had stolen everything from me, I had no reason to keep paying for a house I no longer owned. And when I stopped making payments, everything started to fall apart. I was sitting in my grandmother's small kitchen, a cup of coffee in my hands, when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed one name: Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I knew she would call. I just wanted to see which role she'd play this time: the remorseful mother or the shameless manipulator. "Ivy." Her voice was different from the last time I heard it. No anger, no threats, just urgency, laced with fear. I didn't say anything. I waited for her to continue. "You didn't send the mortgage payment this month," she said, trying to sound calm, but I heard the tension in her voice. "I'm sure you just forgot, but the bank is about to charge a penalty, so if you could..." I cut her off immediately. "Mom, I'm not paying anymore." Silence. Heavy and suffocating. "What?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling more at peace than I had in a long time. "I said I'm not paying anymore. That house isn't mine. You gave it away without even asking me, so now, you can ask Lily to cover the mortgage." "Ivy," her voice shot up in panic. "You can't do this. If you stop paying, the bank will take the house." I shrugged, even though she couldn't see me. "Then you should handle it." "What are you saying? You've been paying for 4 years, you can't just stop." I let out a dry chuckle. "You've been living off me for 4 years, but you had no problem taking everything away from me, did you?" My mother completely lost control. "Ivy, you don't understand. You don't know how much we rely on that money. Your stepfather and I planned everything around the payments you were sending." And then, she made the biggest mistake of her life. "Then where did all the extra money I sent every month go?" I asked, my voice razor sharp. "The mortgage should be nearly paid off by now, shouldn't it?" Silence. I tightened my grip on the phone. "Mom, where did that money go?" She swallowed hard. And then, she spoke the words that sent ice through my veins. "Your stepfather and I used it for other things." I closed my eyes, feeling the blood in my veins boil. "For what?" She took a deep breath. "The Europe trip last year. We used the money for that." It felt like a punch straight to my chest. "What else?" I gritted my teeth. "Lily's college tuition. You know how expensive private universities are." I clenched my fists so tightly that my knuckles ached. "What else?" She hesitated, but then finally spoke. "Some of it went into renovating the city house. For Lily's wedding gift." I let out a laugh, but it was empty, hollow. Still, for 4 years, I worked my ass off believing I was paying for my own home, when in reality, I was funding your vacations, paying for Lily's education, and fixing up the house you planned to give her. "Ivy, don't say it like that," my mother tried to soothe me. "You're the eldest, you have to help the family." "Family?" I hissed, my anger finally exploding. "Have you ever treated me like family? If you did, why did you take everything from me? You don't deserve to be my mother." She started crying. "Ivy, don't do this. If you stop paying, we'll lose the house." I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "It's not we, Mom." My voice was eerily calm. "You will lose the house, and that's your problem, not mine." I hung up. Outside the window, the sky was still bright and blue, but for me, everything had changed. My mother had lost me forever. I thought that after I refused to pay the mortgage, my mother would find a way to manage. She had always been good at manipulating and taking advantage of others, so I assumed she would find someone else to drain dry. But this time, things weren't as easy as before. Just 2 months after our last phone call, I received news from a distant relative. Ivy, your mother is about to lose the house. I wasn't surprised, but there was still a small sense of disbelief. I had paid the mortgage for 4 years, and even though they had drained every cent I put into it, at least a portion of the house had been paid off. But my mother hadn't continued the payments after I stopped, and banks weren't charities. The foreclosure process had begun. My mother and stepfather lost the house. Lily, the same Lily who had laughed in my face and kicked me out, was now being kicked out herself. Lily called me on a quiet weekend afternoon. I stared at my phone screen, her name flashing across it, and couldn't help but smirk. Lily, the golden child who always got everything she wanted, now needed me. I let the phone ring a few more times before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm. "Ivy!" Lily's voice was panicked, completely different from the arrogant tone she had used the day she stood at my doorstep. You have to help me." I tilted my head, waiting. "He took the house," she sobbed. Mom and Dad said everything would be fine, but now the bank has taken it. Jake and I have nowhere to go." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Is that so?" I said, completely emotionless. "Don't talk like that, Ivy," Lily whined. "We're family. You have that big house, you could at least let Jake and me stay for a while." I let out an amused laugh. "Oh, I thought the city house was yours and Jake's. Or did you forget saying that?" Lily fell silent, but I could hear her panicked breathing. "Ivy, please," she whispered. "I have no one else." I let out a small, bitter chuckle. "No one else? What about Mom? She's not helping you?" "Mom got kicked out too." Lily's voice cracked. "Mom and Dad have nowhere to stay. They're trying to borrow money from relatives but no one will help them." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Finally, the wheel of fate had turned. They had taken everything from me, thrown me out without a second thought, and now they were crawling back, begging for my help? Pathetic. I took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "Lily, do you remember what you said to me the day you slammed the door in my face?" Lily didn't answer. "I remember it very clearly," I continued, my voice light but laced with mockery. "You told me to get a hotel, so now you can do the same. Good luck." And I hung up. A week later, I heard from relatives that my mother was begging everyone for money. They had spent every dollar I gave them, wasted it on luxuries, and now, with no one left to exploit, they had collapsed completely. My stepfather tried to borrow from extended family, but no one trusted him anymore. They all knew what kind of person my mother was, and no one wanted to get involved in their mess. Lily and Jake ended up staying at a friend's apartment temporarily, but they couldn't stay there forever. My mother and stepfather had to leave the city, renting a tiny, cheap apartment in the suburbs. They had once lived in a big house, taken lavish vacations, and thought they were smarter than me. But now, they had nothing. And I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. 2 months after my mother lost her house, my life was more peaceful than ever. I cleaned up my grandmother's house, renovated every corner and turned it into a real home. A place where I didn't have to worry about someone coming in and taking everything from me, ever again. I wake up every morning, brew a cup of coffee and sit on the porch, watching the sunlight filter through the trees my grandmother once cared for. For the first time in years, I feel relieved. Free. No more financial burdens. No more phone calls begging for money. No more being treated like a living bank for my family. But, as I had predicted, they came back. One afternoon, while I was trimming the flower beds in the garden, I heard a car pull up to the gate. I looked up, and in an instant, all the old emotions came rushing back. "Mom!" She stood there, wearing a worn-out coat, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen her. The arrogance, the condescension, gone. All that remained was desperation. A few steps behind her, my stepfather lingered, no longer carrying the smug confidence of a man who had once lived off my money. And behind them, Lily, the sister who had thrown me out without a second thought, now looked like an abandoned kitten, her eyes filled with hope as she gazed at me. I said nothing. I simply crossed my arms and waited. My mother stepped forward, her voice weak. "Ivy, I know you're angry. But you can't abandon me like this." I let out a cold chuckle. "Abandon you?" I repeated. "Weren't you the one who told me to leave?" She clenched her hands together, trying to stay composed. "I was wrong, Ivy. I didn't realize how much you meant to this family." She took a deep breath. "Can you help me? Just for a little while? I promise I won't ask for anything else. Just help me cover rent for a bit, so I can get back on my feet." I laughed, but it was empty, devoid of warmth. "You're asking me for money?" She quickly shook her head. "No, not exactly. I just need a little support, Ivy. You still have a stable job, you have this house, and I have nothing." Lily stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "Come on, Ivy, you can't be this heartless. We're family." The word family made me pause for a brief moment. Family? What is family? Is it the people who used me for 4 years? The ones who threw me out without hesitation? The mother who drained my savings for vacations and gifts for her youngest daughter, then told me to grow up when I asked for fairness? No, that is not family. They were selfish people, and I had been a fool for believing I could ever find love among them. I met my mother's eyes, my voice calm but as sharp as a blade. "No." She stared at me, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "What did you say?" I said, "No, you made your choices. Now, you deal with the consequences." Lily's mouth fell open, as if she couldn't believe I was actually rejecting them. "What are you doing? You can't just turn your back on us." I let out a cold, bitter laugh. "Isn't that exactly what you did to me, Lily?" She froze, her face going pale. My mother's hands clenched into fists, and her desperation turned to anger. "You're cruel, Ivy. You're no daughter of mine." I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "But they no longer hurt." "That's right," I said. "And you were never really my mother." I stepped back and closed the gate, right in front of them. They stood there for a few seconds longer, but there was nothing left to say. Eventually they turned and walked away. And I didn't look back. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. I was no longer tied to them, no longer burdened by false responsibilities and the guilt they had forced me to carry. I was no longer the Ivy who bowed her head and allowed herself to be used. Now, I lived for myself. I turned back toward my grandmother's house. The home that was mine. Legally and rightfully. I had lost so much. But what I gained was worth far more. Independence. Peace. And a new life, one that no one could take from me, again. I set down my coffee cup and looked up at the clear blue sky. And I smiled. Ivy's story is a powerful lesson in boundaries, self-reliance, and self-worth. Sometimes, family doesn't mean love. It can mean the people who exploit you the most. She sacrificed. She trusted. And in return, she was betrayed. Only when she stopped, set boundaries, and refused to give unconditionally, did she truly find peace. In life, not everyone deserves your kindness. Don't be afraid to say no, and protect what is yours. What do you think about Ivy's story? If you were in her situation, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel for more emotional stories about family, trust, and independence.